Hey everybody, if you hadn't seen, I had a little bit of an unfortunate mishap with the Izzet Phoenix video that I had posted earlier during the Pioneer RCQ season. There was basically some music in the background that when I tried to use YouTube's tool to replace it, killed all of the audio as well. Now I no longer have the entire script for the video, however I do have all of my audio clips, just not all of my video clips. So what I'm doing here is re-uploading this, going to have all of the deck tech portion and everything out of the way, and I'm gonna just ad-lib a little bit of the introduction. So if you guys missed the Phoenix video, this is what you can potentially look to see at the RC, but definitely what you experienced when you were playing the previous RCQ season against Izzet Phoenix. Now, since this was a couple of months ago, I had a lengthy spiel about what kind of deck Izzet Phoenix actually is, because there was a little bit of up in the airness about what the deck could actually do and how people like to classify it. At the end of the day, whether you consider the fact that it's able to put its namesake card into play in multiples thanks to casting a chain of spells, a combo deck, or if you're able to pack the counter magic, the targeted removal, and just the bigger threats, especially post sideboard, as more of a mid-range deck or even more of like a control style. All you need to know about the way that the Phoenix deck plays is that it is incredibly unique to not only Pioneer, but the way that Izzet decks have previously functioned. The ability to have multiple angles of attack, as well as give unprecedented amounts of card advantage, while keeping up very cheap yet effective interaction is what makes the Phoenix deck not only frustrating to play against, but extremely appealing, especially when it comes to top tier pro players, and why you can usually expect to see it at the top presence of the metagame, even if it isn't the most powerful deck available in the room.
As I mentioned earlier, the core of the Izzet Phoenix deck is Arclight Phoenix, a 3/2 hasty flyer that can be hard cast for 4 mana, but is mostly going to be coming back from the graveyard by chaining together 3 spells on your turn. That means we need cheap cards to chain together, and most importantly, ways to put our Phoenix into our graveyard. While our deck is going to want to be constructed of predominantly spells, Izzet Phoenix has 2 all-star creatures it can play in order to help both parts of its strategy. Ledger Shredder has been a popular card thanks to its flying 1/3 stat line and the ability to grow larger with Connive. This ability fits in with our want to cast multiple spells to get Phoenixes into play, but also gives us a way to discard Phoenixes we've drawn during our turn. Discarding a bird to this bird grows the Shredder as well, helping to add crucial points of damage to our clock. The other creature is the seemingly timid Picklock Prankster, which isn't really here for its 1/3 flying vigilant body. The creature part is just a bonus to the adventure side of the card, Free the Fae. An instant speed way to fill our graveyard, the spell part of this fairy finds us a spell to chain with, counts towards our spells per turn to bring back our Phoenixes, and in a pinch lets us take another Prankster to do it all over again. You can also use Prankster to find copies of Brazen Borrower in your deck, one of the deck's catch-all sort of answers to something that bounces things from big blockers to graveyard hate long enough to seal the deal for a game win. Its 3 power body and flying isn't to be scoffed at, and it's basically like swinging in with a 5th Phoenix worth of damage. We've mentioned wanting to chain together spells and fill the graveyard, so let's take a look at what we're trying to rapidly cast to get our Phoenixes back into play. A package of 1 mana cantrips starts us off in Consider and Opt, working well to quickly add up our spell count, while Consider can also help by binning a Phoenix. Sleight of Hand, while Sorcery Speed, may be one of the more powerful 1 mana effects in our deck, as it looks at 2 cards and can put away an unneeded one, giving us a new card on top of our library. Chaining any number of these cards together is enough to get a Phoenix out of our graveyard, but we still need ways to get them in there. Lightning Axe is a key spell for the Izzet Phoenix deck, as it not only discards a Phoenix, but doing so allows us to deal 5 damage to a creature for just 1 mana. That eliminates just about every major creature threat in the format, including cards like Sheoldred the Apocalypse. Other efficient removal, such as Fiery Impulse and Torch the Tower, are in the deck, also costing 1 mana, but looking to take out smaller threats such as Amalia or opposing Phoenixes with Torch's Exile Clause. Spell Pierce is a 1 mana counterspell that works wonders against opposing Fables and Sorens on curve, while still allowing us to hold up Free the Fae mana. All of these spells are crucially 1 mana, which allows us to fill up our graveyard for the best quote-unquote 1 mana spell of them all, Treasure Cruise. Delving away all of our non-Phoenix cards from our graveyard to draw 3 cards will almost certainly find us a chain we need to get said Phoenixes into play, and at its very worst, gives us 3 looks at answers to whatever is currently threatening our life total. Treasure Cruise is also a key piece to the speed of the Izzet Phoenix list, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. It's not the only Delve spell in our deck though, as Temporal Trespass is another combo piece that allows us to take an extra turn for just 3 mana when we Delve, something that in combination with Arc-like Phoenixes can end the game quite easily. 3 Phoenixes now represent 18 damage across 2 turns, which should be good enough to seal the deal if any Shredders, Pranksters, or even a Shockland happen to get played that game. Need a little extra help? Well, Galvanic Iteration can make that 3 turns for you to swing in, meaning just 2 Phoenixes could be enough to force a GG. It also allows us to copy Treasure Cruise, meaning we draw 6 cards instead of just 3 to assure our deck takes pole position. The last slot in Phoenix decks has been swapped around a little bit, but since Pro Tour MKM, the final slots have been dedicated to some number of Ashiok Dream Render. Both lights out in the mirror match and great against decks that want to search for their own combo pieces. Ashiok is able to fuel our graveyard while removing our opponent's own graveyard in a way that they have to answer via damage unless they want to rapidly lose control of the game. While it could just be a dead card against some decks, the upside of milling our own Phoenixes means it still does something very helpful for our plan A, even when it's at its very worst. Lands in the Phoenix deck have been streamlined down to just 19, although some lists still look to run 20 or more depending on if they include Jwari Disruption or Spikefield Hazard as modal dual-faced cards. Most lists stick to a package of 12 or more blue-red dual lands in the form of 4 Spirebluff Canal, 4 Steam Vents, 4 Pathways, and some number of Stormcarved Coast. While the decks play no basic mountains, they play potentially 3 islands in case they face Field of Ruin, while 2 Hall of Storm Giants operate as a creature land win con for longer games, and at least 1 copy of Odawara Soaring City gives them a second copy of Brazen Borrower's effect that can also target their own things in the case that they run into something like The End. Phoenix sideboards are where most of the decks diverge, but there are a few core cards that most decks run. For the most part, your sideboard in Phoenix is going to be packing 2 different types of cards. First of which is interaction, such as counter magic and additional removal spells, and the second being additional threats that work with your spell slinging deck style. For the interaction, copies of Disdainful Stroke, Negate, and Mystical Dispute are the most commonly played counter spells. Negate is great for spell-based combo decks such as Lotus Field, and helps fight through counter magic wars against control decks. Likewise, Mystical Dispute can be amazing early game, and also a great upgrade to Spell Pierce when fighting on the stack against other counter magic. Disdainful Stroke is a powerful safety valve against decks that want to slam big, beefy creatures or threats like Sheoldred the Apocalypse, while also still hitting things like Emergent Ultimatum. Anger of the Gods, or Brotherhood's End as a sweeper, helps to shore up matches against aggro decks, with Anger of the Gods seeing a little bit more play thanks to the Exile Clause against decks like Amalia that may keep in the reanimation effects against you. It's also a great way to deal with opposing Phoenixes, so as long as you don't do it when you have your own on the field. Additional Ashioks and Brazen Borrowers come in when they're good, while they can be just swapped out 1 for 1 with the one that isn't great after game 1 from the main deck. The additional threats that Phoenix looks to bring in are Young Pyromancer and Crackling Drake, 2 cards that play great with the main plan of casting lots of spells. Again, the mid-range and control decks that turn into longer, grindy games Young Pyromancer is a powerful threat that turns every 1 mana spell into a 1/1 elemental token. This makes it almost impossible for decks to punch through meaningful damage, as you can just chump block ad nauseum with your tokens and swing in with the others while you also reanimate your phoenixes. Crackling Drake is an all-star when you're anticipating graveyard hate, as the card is unaffected by graveyards being exiled, unlike Arclight Phoenix. Drakes count instants and sorceries in both graveyard and exile zones towards its power, making it a constant threat even through cards like Rest in Peace and Leyline of the Void. We used to see Fable the Mirror Breaker alongside Crackling Drake, so you could make a hasty copy of the Drake to swing in for lethal faster, and you may still see people opting to do that. However, there was usually only one copy of Fable in the sideboards, which seems to have given way to additional pieces of interaction, such as Aether Gust or additional Brazen Borrowers. With everything in the deck sorted out, let's go over a little bit of how you'll see Izzet Phoenix play. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this deck is pilot skill, so I won't be able to cover every single scenario you might run into. However, I will cover some common play lines and what the deck's real kind of nut draw looks like, which seems like a great place to start. One of the best possible draws for Phoenix is also the most frustrating part for people that do not like the deck and the way it plays, as it can often be chalked up to RNG rather than a true display of skill, so to speak. The line involves a player chaining together Consider, into Free the Fae, into Treasure Cruise, a sequence of spells that, if done in that order specifically, has roughly an 11.2% chance of happening, thanks to Free the Fae digging 4 cards deep for the cruise. This also requires the Consider putting a card into the graveyard, meaning the Phoenix deck has 5 total cards in the graveyard by the end of their second turn, 2 from the Consider and 3 from Free the Fae. By untapping and playing any combination of 1 mana spells remaining, the Phoenix player can now Treasure Cruise for 1 mana. If a second Consider or Lightning Axe was involved in this spell sequence, up to 2 Arclight Phoenixes can also take flight from the graveyard at the same time. Again, this is a very small chance to happen, but even if the Phoenixes don't come back immediately, the Phoenix player basically still has a full grip of cards, including but not limited to answers for everything the opponent did for the first 3 turns of the game. You could also have a line that doesn't need to delve away the graveyard, but is even more unlikely to happen. This line of play includes hitting as many Arclight Phoenixes as you can in your top third of your deck. Turn 1, Consider binning a Phoenix, followed up with turn 2, Free the Fae, seeing up to 3 additional Phoenixes, and then turn 3, playing out triple 1 mana spells is a magical Christmas land of pain for your opponent that very rarely happens, but it still could happen, you know? The more common lines of play you'll find yourself leaning on involve some pretty fair games of Magic, albeit explosive when you're able to actually pull the trigger on a big Phoenix turn. Opening with Sleight of Hand and tapping out on turn 1 is almost never a bad thing, and following up with a turn 2 Ledger Shredder is a fine sequence so long as you're not on the draw against vampires. Chaining spells to bin Phoenixes and find 3 1-mana cards is fine against decks that don't pack mainboard hate such as Cling to Dust. Otherwise, you can hold your Phoenixes until the turn you're going to spell chain and discard them to connive triggers and hold up counter magic yourself. The more difficult board states are going to be when you're still digging for the correct cards to either interact with your opponent's side of the board or work towards getting your own game plan online. This is where the creature side of Picklock Prankster comes in handy, as a 1/3 body with evasion and doesn't need to tap to attack can chip away at some minor life points while playing defense against smaller creatures after finding you a Sleight of Hand, Lightning Axe, or Treasure Cruise to cast later. You shouldn't be afraid to rip your Galvanic Iteration on a removal spell if you need to deal with something powerful early on, or even to double draw spell if you're really searching for something you need. Having Iteration in the graveyard to flash back is powerful enough to cause some decks to stop and pause to deal with it, buying you some time or saving your Arclight Phoenixes. It's also relevant in that if your opponent doesn't have main deck graveyard hate, you can get 2 iterations over the course of a game. one to help set up the board, and a second to combo with Temporal Trespass.
Some decks are going to be better at stopping your main game plan than others, but Phoenix often has ways it can navigate well enough to triumph even against the harder matchups. Most decks that play to the board in some way, shape, or form are going to be good matches for the Phoenix deck thanks to the recursive nature of Arclight Phoenix and the inability for most decks to exile it for good. Decks like Boros Heroic, Gruul Aggro, and classic Rakdos decks will be even or favorable for the Phoenix deck. Azorius Control has also been a matchup where Phoenix has gotten stronger in the head-to-head, as you can often pressure the control deck at points when their mana or hand is awkward. Lesser seen decks such as Abzan Greasefang, Azorius Spirits, Mono White Humans, and Rakdos Sacrifice will also be favorable for you. The decks that look to combo fast are going to be more difficult for Phoenix to contend with, especially when those combo cards are non-creature spells. Due to the deck being less counter magic heavy than more traditional tempo decks like Spirits, the Phoenix deck will find itself struggling against decks like Lotus Field Combo and Enigmatic Incarnation without an Ashiok Dream Render to prevent the search effects. Likewise, Amalia Combo can be a bit of an issue for Phoenix without a specific sequence of cards, including Torch the Tower and Ashiok to shut off Chord of Calling. Quintorius Combo may not see as much play and may be a little slower, but comboing with a Planeswalker will be hard for Izzet Phoenix to stop without Spell Pierce in hand. These decks are what the extra counter magic in our sideboard is for, while Amalia decks may be met with Anger of the Gods to keep the board clean and only have us worried about Collected Company. Rakdos Vampires is also a potentially rough matchup on paper, as any hand from Rakdos that takes away key spells like Free the Fae or Spell Pierce before dropping their Sorin Tell combo is going to be a pain to deal with. However, the recursive nature of our Phoenixes can come in handy sometimes here, as we'll often have sacrifice fodder to pay for Vein Ripper's ward cost. The life gain may be annoying, but it's not impossible for Phoenix to chip through given enough time. The downside for Phoenix pilots, though, is that the Vampires deck usually doesn't give a ton of time between their turn 3 Ripper, turn 4 Sheoldred or Archfiend of the Dross, and a turn 5 or 6 Ripper pending on a Fabled Treasure token being made. Archfiend and Ripper both dealing 2 damage when your creatures die can also start to add up, so even though Young Pyromancer is a great sideboard card here, make sure you aren't killing yourself with it. So that's the Izzet Phoenix deck. What are you guys thinking about it for not only just how you are playing currently in your Pioneer games, but also what do you feel like it's going to be doing at the regional championships coming up in actually just a few weeks? Let me know down in the comments below, and if this is your second time watching the video because of the unfortunate mishap, thanks for bearing with me, and let me know if there are any sort of tweaks you think that the Phoenix list has had between now and then that maybe I should cover in a cardboard or coffee or something. As always, you can just tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and in general, Magic content from me. Thanks for watching.